everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be talking to you from Maine, the first state in the United States that has brought the right to food to this country. I just have been asked to share some of the story about how we came from here to there. In Maine, we have a saying, you can't get there from here, but we did. We just kept working at it. And I just wanted to share that story with you all today in hopes that it might be good seed in fertile soil. I'm a farmer in Penobscot, Maine. We have about 100-acre farm where we raise primarily dairy now, but we consider ourselves grass farmers and are really working on cultivating soil first and foremost and allowing animals to harvest food that we can't eat, to harvest grass and turn that into meat and milk for our community. That is what brought me into advocacy work. I had just been a homeschooling mother, and I shouldn't say just, but I was a homeschooling mother and farmer. And an inspector came down our driveway in 2009 and wanted to know where we were slaughtering our chickens. We were slaughtering them at a neighbor's farm, a fully inspected facility. And the inspector let us know that he wasn't really allowed to share that facility with us by the USDA regulations. And then he came back a couple weeks later, having noticed that we also sold fresh milk, and was letting us know that the department in our own state was redefining what we were doing, redefining what category we fit into. And we wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore unless we could add significant infrastructure improvements that were well beyond the scale of what our small scale diversified farm could manage. So at that point, we had been working for about a dozen years, both farming and working off the farm to support the farming. And we had just made a leap into farming as our full livelihood, and saw that the rug got pulled out from underneath us, and that wasn't going to work anymore unless we could afford to make these significant improvements. So the inspector actually said to us, well, why don't you go to our state capitol? Why don't you gather your people and offer testimony? These poultry rules aren't finished yet. So I didn't know who those people would be and how I was supposed to gather them, but I wrote a letter to our customers and I said, listen, this thing is going on. There's a squawk about poultry and we need help. And the week of Christmas, some 50 people showed up to Augusta and testified that there was nothing wrong with the rules as they were. We all liked having a direct farmer to patron exchange, and there was no food safety issue that needed to be corrected for. So what we learned in that process was the state legislators and the regulatory agencies told us that their hands were tied, that they were bound by rules at the federal level, and they had to implement these structural requirements that didn't make sense for the newly burgeoning small scale farm community-based food model that was growing all over Maine. And then we found out with the issue of raw milk that there was no public hearing process, there was no regulatory input, there was no feedback from the public. They were simply redefining us as processors and not producers or farmers, and that put us into a whole different category, again requiring a scale of infrastructure that was well beyond the 3 cows that we had that were selling directly to our neighbors and our farm patrons. So at that point, it became clear to us that we were not really dealing with a statutory problem. We weren't dealing with a regulatory problem. What we were dealing with was a democracy problem, that there was no way for those of us who eat food and those of us who grow food to be stakeholders or to be have input in the decisions that were being made. About how we exchange food, about what our traditional foodways were, about the relationships that we had in our community. So we started asking questions, who was making the rules, who was benefiting from the rules, who was losing in that process, who was absorbing the cost, And what we found at that point was our state veterinarian, who was in charge of making the meat rules, in charge of interacting with the federal government, with the USDA, said, nobody ever thought that when they made 1,000 bird exemption for poultry or a 10,000 bird exemption, nobody ever thought that anybody was going to grow chickens under that, because the industry had already been consolidated. So they gave the rulemaking to Purdue. And so now that all of you are showing up and these things don't fit, some 30 years later, there's already this structure in place. And that structure is tied to cooperative agreements with our state regulatory agency, which has funding attached. And we must write the rules in this particular way. We started asking further questions. Well, who's all of a sudden in Maine, we had been able to sell milk directly to our neighbors up until that point legally. We had reached out and asked those questions before we began, and it had all been legal. And at that point, we realized that there was a whole new trajectory that was coming down from the Food and Drug Administration. And it was tied closely to a CDC Healthy America 2020 plan, which had as one of its goals to increase the number of states that would eradicate the sale of raw milk. So there was, again, this larger picture that was putting downward pressure on our local food system and on small-scale diversified farms. As context, around that same time, around 2009, there was a bill called S510, or now known as the Food Safety Modernization Act, that was going through Congress. And as part of the process, they were very upfront and said, part of the trade-off for this is that small-scale diversified farms will not be able to comply, and some of those farms will be lost, and that was an acceptable cost to them. Again, we were asking the question, who's making these rules? Where is this coming from? Clearly, in our local food system, we don't have this food safety issue that we're seeing in the industrial food system. So if there's no problem, what are we solving for? And at that point, we learned that Michael Taylor, who had been the agribusiness, industrial chemical, agriculture executive, had written the white paper on Roundup, on glyphosate. And he had numerous positions in the food safety inspection system at the federal level, and also would eventually become the food czar of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So this was really putting the future of our local food systems right in the hand of Monsanto executives. So at the same time, you might all remember around 2008, there was a big failure of the economy and a recession. And at that time, there was a mantra that the banks were too big to fail. The federal government had to invest to save the banks, to save the automotive industry. And it just seemed like a really stark contrast to me that the banks were too big to fail. The automotive industry was too big to fail, but the small scale farms were never too small to disappear. And we saw that what was happening to our farm could happen to a number of different farms all across the state of Maine. And then we started hearing about really aggressive actions by the FDA on farms in different states, especially Amish farms in Pennsylvania, Vernon Hirschberger in Wisconsin. There were raids against co-ops in California, and we were talking about things happening at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning with drawn guns. And so it just really seemed like all of these big pressures that were happening outside of Maine, we were beginning to see those, the trajectory marching in Maine in that same direction. And that the farms were just going to be collateral damage, and our local food systems as well. So again, we kept asking questions, and when we got as far as we could at the state level, they were really saying, these cooperative agreements that are in place are rooted in Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1967. That's what authorized these cooperative agreements that allow our commissioner in the state to enter into any kind of contract with a corporation or the federal government agencies that most of the time the public can't see. And it also cedes the jurisdiction for our state meat, and then definitely our local and our regional meat. It cedes the jurisdiction for every piece of meat to the USDA. So of course we were, this very small farm in Maine, and what can we do? We didn't want the food system that people were painstakingly building up to disappear. Our relationships with our friends and neighbors that we'd had for years were threatened. And so we had the option of doing nothing, because that had a clear outcome, or we could do something. We could try to erect a bit of a protection around our local food system and see what would happen. So that gave us a different set of questions to ask, not who's benefiting, who's making the rules, but who's making the decisions for our communities in particular. What rights do we want to encode into law at the community level, and what relationships do we want to have with each other in our community, and how can we protect that legally? How can we put the rule of law behind us? So that led us to reclaim a part, and just a small part of our local food system. We thought we could at least protect the direct exchange of food between a farmer or a food producer and our customers. If we can say relationally, we agree to be in this relationship, we don't need a third party to interact and assure safety that we can manage between ourselves. And so that led us to realize a big part of what had happened at the state level was that we lost the ability to define ourselves. If we lost the ability to define ourselves and over the language that governed our food system, then we had lost complete jurisdiction. So we wanted to reclaim that by asserting authority at the local level, at the municipal level, and defining ourselves, defining our traditional foodways, reclaiming a self-determination, and truly staking out a space in the legal field for a community-based food model. We had some great examples to look to in Maine. The towns of Shepley and Newfield had drafted local ordinances to protect their water supply from Nestle, which was putting in test drills. So they had drafted some rights-based ordinances, and that was the first time I came across that language, the first time I started learning about that. And then a little bit closer by, in a very small town of Montville, Maine, they had also drafted a rights-based ordinance to protect their local crops from GMO contamination, and to keep GMOs out of their town. So we had these templates at the local level. And then we also had some language at the time. In 2010, both Wyoming and Florida were working on what they called food freedom legislation to protect the me to the hand-to-hand, face-to-face food exchange. And so we started mashing those things together and also adding language that was very particular to Maine and our experience. That process all began in 2010. By 2011, we went to our town meetings in Maine, which is a really lovely vestige of sort of direct participatory democracy still, where the people in the town are the legislative body, and we can still vote on things that are, as our Constitution says, local in character. So we had drafted these ordinances. We introduced them in 5 towns in 2011, and in 4 it passed at our town meeting. And town meeting can be just as contentious as the legislature, and we can debate all sorts of things for long periods of time, including funding the local library if that's worth our town dollars. And we had just sat through about a half an hour debate on that, and then the local food ordinance came up. And for the first time that I had ever experienced it before or since, the people of the town applauded themselves after voting in this local food ordinance. It really was a way of reclaiming our authority and asserting a jurisdiction that we knew the state would not recognize. So there was definitely a risk involved, and the people of the town were willing to take that risk. It did eventually, and I'll breeze over this part in pretty quick motion, but it provoked a lawsuit. The state did sue a farmer. It went all the way to the Maine Supreme Court. The Maine Supreme Court ruled against the farmer, but did not touch the ordinance and did not in any way preempt it, but instead kick the ball back to the legislature. So that was right away in 2011, as these ordinances passed. By the end of that year, the state had sued a farmer. That took several years to play out, 2013, 2014. Once the farmer lost in court, it really galvanized the communities across the state to pass these local ordinances, because they could see this was one place where we still had legal authority to assert. In 2013, the work took me to the state capitol for the first time, to our governor's office, where I met who had become our legislative champion, Senator Craig Hickman. He was a brand new legislator at the time. He had run for office for the same reasons that we had written these local ordinances, for losing control of our local food supply. And so we were sort of a star-crossed match that met in our governor's office at the time. He called me shortly after that and said, "I've put in a concept bill about food sovereignty. Do you have any language? Any ideas about what we could do?" So I showed him our local ordinance, and we started working from there. What we were asking the state to do is just to acknowledge, to recognize that our municipalities had the authority over these these me to thee transactions. We lost, and we lost, and we lost for 6 years. The court case happened. We lost at the Maine Supreme Court. So several years later, we realized that part of what was undergirding the support kept growing in the community level, but we never quite had the enough leverage over the corporate lobbyists and over the industry when we got to the State House. So we needed to increase that leverage. And we were being told at that time, in 2010, at the beginning of all this, there was a case where the FDA made some really stark statements about the rights that we don't have. They said there was no absolute right to consume or feed children any particular food. They said there was no deeply rooted historical tradition of unfettered access to foods of all kind. And they said that the assertion of a fundamental right to our own bodily and physical health is unavailing, because we do not have a fundamental right to obtain any food we wish. So at that point, Senator Hickman and I put our heads together, and, fairly bruised from defeat, but also realizing this was no place to stop, decided to go big. Let's put it in writing. If they're saying we don't have the right, let's say we do have the right. And we began working on a constitutional resolution to add to our Declaration of Rights in our state constitution that would assert affirmatively that we do actually have the right to foods of our choosing for our own physical bodily health and well-being. But at the same time, Maine was also seeing increasing rates of hunger, of food insecurity. And whenever the proposals came to our state level government for policy, the food and farming things were in one camp, and the hunger and food insecurity and how do we feed people was always in another camp. And so we also, in the language of our Right to Food Amendment, for the first time articulated a human rights statement that we all have a right to food, period. So we put those two things together, the food sovereignty, the food freedom, the human rights, and proposed this amendment. We got close. There was a lot of political theater. We lost again. In 2015, that was our first attempt. 2 years later, our legislative sessions here are 2 years in the running. 2 years later, in 2017, we said, let's have another go at the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. Towns across Maine kept passing these local food ordinances. At that time, there were 20 towns. It had quadrupled since 2011. The pressure kept growing, and we have a small representative legislature here in Maine, so it's not uncommon for us to see our legislators in the supermarket or out in the community at community events. So every town where these ordinances would pass, their legislator then became very interested in what's my community doing that I need to pay attention to. So we were growing the leverage of the community-based food production model in the state capitol, in the halls of the state capitol. By 2017, the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was again put forward, and it passed, and the governor signed it. It was enacted into law. It was originally called an act to recognize local control regarding local food and water systems, because of course there's no local food without water. And Maine is also under a great deal of pressure by Nestle trucking our water out of the state. And that's another big issue. So that was stripped out of the bill immediately. That was a real lightning rod, as we had expected. And the Nestle representative actually said, local control threatens our parent company. So they were very upfront about why this could not go, water sovereignty could not be included in this bill. When that law was signed by our governor, it had 90 days to go into effect. At that point, our Commissioner of Agriculture went into overdrive, got on the phone with the USDA at the federal level, and said, this is a problem for Maine's meat inspection. This is a problem because of that 1967 Federal Meat Inspection Act. So the Secretary of Agriculture said that if our law was actually going into effect, they would effectively come in and take over Maine's meat inspection. So we had an emergency session of our legislature to amend it. We were forced to take out meat and poultry in order to recognize all of the other pieces of the local jurisdiction of food. And ever since then, towns across Maine continue to pass this local ordinance. And now I think there are more than 130 towns across Maine. We only have 500 municipalities. So that is effectively 20% of Maine's population now lives under this system of food sovereignty, and also 20% of Maine's municipalities, both towns and cities, not just our town meeting level of governance, but also city councils and town councils have voted to enact food sovereignty. So in 2019, the next legislative session, we realized that we needed to make another push to enshrine the right to food in our Constitution and the right to foods of our choosing. So we did make another push. We got very, very close, but that legislative session went into 2020 and our legislature shut down for the pandemic. And so our legislative champion termed out the proposal laid on the table, and thankfully, the next session, the torch had been passed to a representative, Billy Bob Falkingham, and he was determined that we would get this across the finish line and bring along the Republican caucus as well. In order to have a constitutional amendment become part of our Constitution in Maine, we have to get a 2/3 supermajority in both chambers, and then it goes out to the ballot for the people to vote on, and then it can pass by a simple majority. So it's a very high bar, and we were able to clear that bar due to just an extraordinary level of collaboration and cooperation. Both of our legislative champions for the right to food were from different parties. A Democrat and a Republican both fought their own leadership in their parties at different times to bring along their caucus, and worked with each other and with us as community advocates. So that went, we got more than a 2/3 supermajority. We got close to 75% in both our Senate and our House. That put it on our ballot November of 2021, and it prevailed by 61%. So a landslide victory for the right to food. Now our challenge is educating and spreading awareness about what it means to fully realize the right to food, in addition to having this a constraint piece. So I thought it might be helpful, having kind of done a quick romp through the story of how these things came to be, is to take a step back and talk a little bit about the definitions, so we have some context. Like what does food sovereignty actually mean? It's very similar to a term that is more often used in food circles of food democracy, but it's really reclaiming a decision making for the people who eat food and the people who grow food. It's very simplest, but I do just want to read what it means. When we first engaged in food sovereignty, we didn't know it had that term. We did it because it was necessary. And thankfully, over the years, learned that there are small farmers, small scale, diversified across the globe, who were responding to similar pressures with slightly different tools. But the most effective that we came to cross paths with and to learn to know were a group called La Via Campesina, the way of the peasant. So in our country, we don't really like the term peasant. It's sort of derogatory, and we should graduate from that class of citizen. But if we can roughly translate it to small-scale farmer, I think that it makes more sense in our own cultural context. But La Via Campesina really worked on this idea of food sovereignty and was able to articulate this definition that certainly makes sense in our context. And I want to, if I can, just ask you to listen for what the rights are that are included here, and then what are the principles. So it is, as articulated in 2007, food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. So when the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed in 2017, we had been able to enshrine some of those principles into law, but none of the rights. So that's why we felt we needed to take another bite at the apple and try to enshrine the rights that were also outlined. Food sovereignty as a concept has 6 principles. That it focuses on food for people. That is that the right of people to have access to healthy, sufficient, culturally appropriate food should be the center of agriculture more than commodities for trade. It should have a national priority that we can feed ourselves before it becomes a commodity, a currency. That it values food providers, that food systems are localized, that food control or decision-making should be local. And that one was really important to us, again, that the right of food providers to have control over the land, the seeds, the water, and just rejecting the privatization of our natural resources. And the 5th principle is building knowledge and skills. So that we defined in Maine statute as traditional foodways, and made sure that not just our food exchanges, but all of the education and the cultural connection and the community relationships that happen over food exchanges would be protected. And these more traditional ways of making and preserving and processing food could go from one to another in this legally protected space. And the last principle is that it works with nature, so that we are maximizing the contribution of ecosystems and avoiding costly toxic inputs to just improve the resilience of local food systems. So that's food sovereignty. And then I also wanted to read the language of our Right to Food Amendment as it was enacted in 2021. It's Article 25 of, Article 1, Section 25. That's our Declaration of Rights in Maine's Constitution. So we only have 25 sections. This one is all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to food, including the right to save and exchange seeds and the right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being, as long as an individual does not commit trespassing, theft, poaching, or other abuses of private property rights, public lands, or natural resources in the harvesting, production, or acquisition of food. So there are 4 components to our amendment. The first one is an internationally recognized definition, the natural, inherent, unalienable right to food. So this refers to the right of all individuals, and we made sure to use the word individuals so that it could be differentiated legally from corporate persons. No corporation can claim a right to food under this amendment. So the right of all individuals to be free from hunger. So beyond this most basic component for human survival, the right to food essentially is about people being able to feed themselves in dignity. So you're not making trade-offs between other essential human needs and being able to feed yourself, feed your family, so that you'd have autonomy over your food and in turn, then your health, your physical and mental well-being. So there are 4 pieces to that definition of the right to food. That food would be adequate, available, accessible, and sustainable. This is actually also tied into, again, internationally, the experience of peasants or small farmers across the globe. They were also moved around in the same time period to be working on an international articulation of this right. And came up with a declaration that wasn't adopted at the international level called the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Peasants. And then it goes on to say, and other people who live in rural areas. So like, what do we need to have a life of dignity in rural places? In Maine's articulation of the right to food, we then went on to incorporate food freedom and food sovereignty, that we would absolutely have the right to save and exchange seeds, that could not be taken from us as an elemental part of human survival. And then the right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their choosing. We've seen some states pass a constitutional right to garden or a statutory right to garden, or a right to hunt and fish. So this language incorporates all of that. We're talking about any way that we feed ourselves in dignity is protected. This part is the constraint of the government, but also requires the government to, as a duty bearer to us, the rights holders, to facilitate the right to food, to restrain any third-party actor from preventing our ability to grow our own food and to feed ourselves in dignity, and to respect and protect that right. So I think I can leave it there. I did want to put one other sort of legal piece out there for people in different states in the United States, at any rate, that the important provision in our own constitutions at the state level to look at is almost every state has something that is taken from the Declaration of Independence, which was not a legally binding document. But in Maine, it is called, it's Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution, and it's called Power is Inherent in the People. When we began this, that was a big piece of what we were rooting these local ordinances in. In Maine, it says that all power is inherent in the people. All free governments are founded in their authority and instituted for their benefit, and they therefore have an unalienable and indefeasible right to institute government and to alter, reform, or totally change the same when their safety and happiness require it. We certainly felt like our safety required it, our happiness required it. This provision is even stronger in some states. Pennsylvania, it's stronger. New Hampshire calls it the right to revolution. So that's something to look for in state constitutions. And then home rule. In Maine, we have one of the strongest home rule, both laws and constitutional provisions in the country. California is another one, some of the Western states. But that is what enabled us to assert that authority at the local level of the rights-based language that was different than a regulatory ordinance. So I will leave it there and just encourage you all that we have these tools in a democratic toolbox at our disposal. They're dusty, but we have to take them out of the toolbox and use them in order to maintain the rights and that are just fundamental to our health, our survival, and our well-being. And I would encourage you all to look for those tools, and certainly Maine stands ready to help anybody else who takes up this effort.